Honestly, I think it might. I don't know if y'all can like see it there. Because the light coming in is backlit. Yeah.
Do we want to? I think we can see the front of the court.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then you and I can be right.
Right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect.
That's better. I can see your faces. 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Did you get it?
Mom, Dad?
Yes, absolutely.
One, two, three.
You're welcome.
Josh, while we get set up.
Where was
All right. You got your water. All right. Come on in, guys. Have a seat. Ben, good scholars.
So do we need to start like a new video or?
I think it just goes.
Okay.
Anyone else take
I think it's personally fine if we just keep it a big video, but.
I had an interesting one myself, so I didn't have much time. Right. Yes, yes, and the little kids. Yeah, that's phenomenal. Yeah. And somebody was here. Yeah, exactly.
Hey Josh, can you stand back there?
I really want to be comment.
Yeah.
I think that's okay. Yeah.
You were late on, weren't you?
Yeah, oh, yeah, I am. Yeah. Like, no, I read this whole thing. It's like, oh, yeah.
What a team.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really nice. It's like,
Alex, we have yours printed? Not gonna let me down?
We will.
We will. Doesn't sound good. All right. Well, we need to wait until it's Katie said, watching the live stream from DC, Miriam killed it. Super excited to see John. Veronica,
Pretty.
gave me a lot of grief this weekend, Veronica. I want you to know that. You care even? I'm gonna say you probably don't.
But were you here at 3 a.m. trashing the place?
no, she wasn't. So there you go.
So at least that,
Yeah,
so
scholar.
we take that.
And holiday.
Exactly, yeah. And 4-1. So you're really just trying
Didn't
to.
go well.
Yeah.
When you're building,
Last year they did not.
in the general.
Was it more muffy?
No.
We did. I don't know.
All right. Let's see, make sure we got it. Just 1 more minute. Some of our alums are watching from out of state, which is really cool. Heard from some Thesis veterans here, so that's nice. Juniors, you getting excited or nervous? Which one?
So excited.
Excited?
Woo!
How about nervous? No?
No. I'm getting. Oh wait.
Let's see. We need someone to get the door when it's at the appropriate. Oh, it's all right. Ready? Welcome everyone. Day one, number two, Josh Diaz. Again, this is a topic I'm so fascinated with, this idea of the secularization thesis and the battle between politics and religion and modernity in the last 30 to 40 years. Such a relevant topic. And again, as you all know, Josh will be attending Georgetown University. And again, I've got some Georgetown current students watching this right now. It has been a joy to work with these two. I mean, Miriam and Josh have been phenomenal leaders of Model UN, but just academic leaders. I mean, this is the pinnacle of what, success of what PA is about. I mean, the students have worked so hard on these projects, and you're seeing a year's worth of hard work. In Josh's case, 110 page honors thesis project. And those in the audience are not familiar, the requirement for thesis is 50 pages, but many students go above and beyond. I think this year, I haven't got an average. I'm sure it's going to be well over 70 pages, the average project will be. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and protege, Josh Diaz.
Thank you, Mr. Toppich. My name is Josh Diaz, and my honors senior thesis is titled God's Not Dead, the Clash of Secularism and Religion in Post-Colonial States. The purpose of this thesis has been to reconcile how religion can bring peace and division across different societies. Firstly, this thesis explores the genesis and spread of the secularization thesis and how it has been proven false. I then transition into my studies of the political and cultural attitudes towards faith and secularity in India and Nigeria, which serve as my two preeminent case studies for examining the interaction of church and state outside of the West. Ultimately, this thesis purports that we are living in a post-secular era defined by the intersection of religious identities and secular governance. There were three books and authors that really helped me understand the role of religion in international politics, as well as within my case studies. In Global Rebellion, Religious Challenges to the Secular State, Mark Juergensmeyer explores the religious revival experienced in the 1980s as a direct response to the spread of secularism. He shows how the dual diffusion of the nation-state framework and a Western understanding of religion is foundational to the complex relationship between politics and religion in the modern era. For my India chapter, Modi's India by Christoph Jafferlot was my most helpful source in tracking the growth of the modern Hindu nationalist movement. He shows how different modern India has become from that of what her founders intended based on the politicization of religious identities. The 10th Parallel by Eliza Griswold covers the clash of Muslim and Christian communities along the 10th parallel, and Nigeria is her opening case study. While Griswold does an excellent job at examining Muslim-Christian tensions, she also exposes how these religions have come together and influenced each other at times. The Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, the Open Access Religions Journal, and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University have all also been instrumental in helping me hear from a variety of perspectives on secularism and the politicization of religion in India and Nigeria. The original secularization thesis came about in the 1960s with the simple question, is God dead? Which essentially asks whether religion was losing its social influence around the world. Many experts answered yes. Intellectuals during this time period believed that the world as a whole would see a complete divorce of politics and religion. Sources of authority and truth would stem from science and logic, and religious beliefs would be relegated to personal and private matters. On the whole, the secularization thesis was simply defined as the process whereby religious thinking, practices, and institutions would lose their social significance. Other prominent sociologists, such as Peter Berger, went as far as to say that by the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. The basis for these claims can be found through the process of decolonialization and the general diffusion of Western thought after World War II. Following World War II, there is a huge emphasis on conflict prevention, as well as creating a rational world order. Secularism was seen as a central component in this endeavor in order to modernize and progress past the violence of the past. Additionally, The two remaining world powers, the US and the USSR, were both staunchly secular. Statesmen and politicians from former colonies around the world, such as India, Nigeria, Iran, Egypt, and even Cuba, all redefined their nations as secular ones and enshrined secularism into their constitutions. These men were generally all Western educated, and many felt as if their countries needed to modernize, which they defined as being more alike to Western powers. Secularization turned out to be more than a political process. It came to be viewed as an assault on an individual's very identity. Political movements underpinned by religious fundamentalism cropped up around the world in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism throughout the 1980s, causing academics and intellectuals to begin to make note of a religious revival in politics, as well as to abandon the notion of the secularization thesis. The two case studies I have chosen to analyze this intersection of faith and secularity was the Hindu nationalist movement in India and Islamic nationalism in Nigeria. These nations both have extremely religious populations and were subject to secularization under British colonialism. Together, the unique experiences of these countries with religion illustrate why religion still matters today and how faith coexists with secularism. Hinduism did not exist as an organized religion or cohesive identity before colonialism, and actually referred to a broad array of different rituals, traditions, and sacred texts. Indian religions also did not dichotomize between religion and politics. This is partly due to the fact that Hinduism historically differs from Western religions and that it does not contain a canon scripture, organizational body or church, or central spiritual authorities. This lack of organization meant that the state would act as a central political and spiritual authority. This relationship worked so well for so long because India also possesses a long tradition of religious tolerance and syncretism. Hindu and Islamic kings in pre-colonial India respected each other's faith immensely, and there is a large degree of cultural exchange between these and other religious groups. Religious conflict was spiked drastically when the British formally colonized India in 1857. To handle India's astonishing religious diversity, the British explicitly engaged in divide and rule policies to efficiently manage the logistics of colonization as well as to prevent uprising. Lord Elphinstone, a British statesman and colonist, wrote of India in 1857 that divide et imperia was an old Roman maxim and it shall be ours. This translates to divide and conquer and refers to policies designed to maintain control over India by encouraging dissent between the various religious groups on the subcontinent. The laws of the British Raj were inherently secular, but they quickly found that local faiths cannot just be ignored. Thus, exceptions were made for personal laws in regards to marriage, divorce, inheritance, and succession, based on religious texts. Several laws began being implemented to appease Hindus, Muslims, and the growing Christian population, leading to a significant clash of laws in British India. Personal laws became significant markers of communal identity and actualized the British conception of Hindu and Muslim communities in India as extremely distinct and inherently oppositional. To win the electoral majority in this new system the British set up and sway with the British, political opportunists founded Hindu reformist movements and political parties, such as the Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj, that sought to unify Hinduism. They argued that Islam and Christianity would displace traditional Hindu beliefs if Hinduism did not become more organized and orderly. However, they inadvertently westernized local Indian traditions by creating a more reductive but unified and authoritative form of Hinduism. Religious groups overcame their differences briefly to gain their collective independence from Britain in 1947. While independence marked the culmination of a unified Indian struggle, partition sparked decades of religious tensions as Muslims fled for the Muslim-majority Pakistan and Hindus vice versa. The mass movement of people to and from India and Pakistan resulted in killing, looting, raping, and wide-scale destruction between Hindu and Muslim communities. Now, Indians of all creeds were horrified by the violence of partition, leading to the secular Congress Party to become the most dominant faction of the independence coalition. Jawaharlal Nehru, as a constitutional drafter, leader of the Congress Party, and India's first president, enshrined secularism not only into India's constitutions, but into India's national character. He defined secularism in an Indian context as the equal respect for all religious disciplines. The Congress Party fostered Indian secularism carefully until the 1980s, when India saw the dual rise of religious nationalism, as well as the fall of Congress Party due to corruption and scandals. The RSS was a Hindu reformist movement that started in 1922 and came to represent the Hindu right after independence. The RSS, after independence, moved to become a parent organization to other movements such as the Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj, and founded several important civil society organizations such as trade unions, student groups, and religious bodies. This network came to be known as the Sangh Parivar, or the family of the RSS, and provided the basic support needed for the eventual founding of their political wing, the BJP, in 1980. The BJP was created when much of the world was experiencing a religious revival in politics in the 1980s. It started off as a leader in a larger anti-Congress coalition. Finally, in the 2014 election season, though, the BJP gained enough traction to free itself from other coalitions due to the downfall of the Congress Party, economic struggles, and the charismatic leadership of their Prime Minister candidate, Narendra Modi. The campaign of the BJP and Modi in 2014 was extremely successful because it focused on these issues. The elements of its Hindu nationalism mission could still be clearly seen. However, the extent to which Hinduism would be integrated into the government and laws was not communicated until after the Hindu right was comfortably situated in power. This resulted in a bait and switch. However, the Hindu right has been so effective in demonizing Muslims and propping itself up that it has been able to continue winning elections as well as imposing its ideology onto Hindus. The modern ideology of the BJP, the RSS, and the Hindu right is referred to as Hindutva. Hindutva is the idea that to be truly Indian is to be Hindu. This term fuses the idea of religion, nationality, and culture all under one. This idea underlines all of the BJP's actions and has flourished in India's current political climate. One of the most violent consequences of this has been cow vigilantism. Groups such as the Gau Rakshaks go around India, killing those accused of cow slaughter or those working in the beef industry, since cows are a sacred Hindu symbol. Their victims are mostly Muslims, and most of the time they act on accusation rather than fact. After Modi won again in 2019 and the BJP held on to its legislative majority, the Hindu right has moved to implement more official laws designed to increase the Hindu population of India and decrease the presence of religions like Islam in India. Examples include the 2019 Citizenship Amendment Bill, which is the first bill in India's history to implement religious criteria for citizenship because it grants Hindus expedited citizenship into India. Several states have also imposed restrictions on interfaith marriages based on the love jihad conspiracy theory, which posits that Muslim men are marrying Hindu women solely to convert them. Whether at the state or national level, the policies being implemented are designed to maintain the Hindu majority and disadvantage other religious minorities. Despite these authoritarian laws, not all hope is lost for India. During the partition, when religious tensions were arguably at their highest, a Sikh doctor named Kashteva Singh saved the lives of many Muslims and Hindus. In his book, Love is Stronger Than Hate, Singh says he helped because of the tenets of his faith, such as service to humanity, compassion, and generosity. There exist many more instances of Hindus saving Muslims and vice versa during partition that Singh observed in his book. These acts of compassion is how India managed to stay together during the partition crisis. Religious communities came together again as the Modi administration floundered in its COVID-19 response and pinned the blame on Muslims. Local Hindu, Sikh, and Jain temples began coordinating with Christian churches and Islamic mosques in certain cities to provide support for the poor and sick. Faith has continuously kept India united during times of crisis, such as during partition and COVID, and has proven to be one of the country's greatest strengths rather than a hindrance. Now on to Nigeria. Islam was first introduced into Nigeria from its northern borders as Islam spread down into Africa. The inhabitants of northern Nigeria began practicing Islam as trade with the Muslim empires became more important. Eventually, Nigerian Muslim kingdoms rose to prominence in the Middle East and North Africa trade, and much of the population converted, displacing traditional African religion in this region. In 1803, an Islamic scholar named Uthman Dan Fodio launched a jihad against the various Muslim Nigerian kings because he felt they were not properly adhering to Sharia law, and he established the Sokoto Caliphate. He united over 30 different emirates in this caliphate, making the Sokoto Caliphate one of the most powerful kingdoms in Western Africa and standardizing the practice of Islam in this region. Christianity, on the other hand, was introduced to Nigeria from its southern coastlines. Christianity took off in the south because its geography allowed exposure to European trade routes. These routes brought missionaries to build schools, hospitals, and other needed services along the coast. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Britain would establish two colonies called the Southern Nigerian Protectorate and the Northern Nigerian Protectorate. It made sense to have two separate territories because the North was almost entirely Muslim and the South almost entirely Christian. Additionally, the North had its own Islamic system of government and the South had its own tribal system of government. However, in 1914, a British officer by the name of Frederick Lugard unified the protectorates as Nigeria. The decision to combine the territories had two motivations. First was simply administrative convenience, as the British could consolidate its Western African territories into one. However, the amalgamation of these territories was also meant to prevent opposition to British authority. The British adopted a divide and rule policy, pitting Muslims and Christians against each other politically, culturally, and economically. During the colonial period, British officers would blatantly exploit the religious differences in Nigeria by implementing a Western style of government in the South and preserving Islamic government structures in the North. This tactic is an aspect of divide and rule policy known as indirect rule. By keeping Islamic law in place, the British could reap the benefits of religious legitimacy while still puppet mastering Sharia law in the North. This power structure kept the Muslim North as a politically dominant entity since they were not completely overhauling their government. It also resulted in the North being much poorer than the South, as the British only built schools, hospitals, and banks in southern Nigeria. Sustaining these differences were intentional on part of the British and were meant to sow division between Muslim and Christians. This is reflected in a quote from Lugard. What we often call the Northern Protectorate of Nigeria today can be better described as the poor husband, whilst its southern counterpart can be fairly described as the rich wife of this woman of substance and means. A forced union of marriage between these two will undoubtedly result in peace, prosperity, and maritable bliss for both husband and wife for many years to come. It is my prayer that this union will last forever. This analogy is deeply disturbing, but nonetheless accurate as to the intention of the British, as well as the resulting power structure of independent Nigeria. Nigeria would gain its independence in 1960 and tried to implement a secular civilian government. This first republic, though, would only last about 3 years, and from 1963 until 1999, the nation was rocked by civil wars and near constant coups. In this time period, the country would experience nearly 40 years of military rule, almost exclusively headed up by Muslims located in the north. Of the heads of state here, 11 out of 12 are Muslim, and many displayed an unfair preference for Islam over Christianity in their policies. Religious tension and communal fighting were also extremely frequent during this time period, and major riots with death tolls ranging in the high 100s broke out almost monthly. Riots got especially violent starting in the 1980s when the world was experiencing the so-called religious resurgence. The conflicts were started over things as small as the placement of markets in villages, or as large as when a Muslim military leader enrolled Nigeria secretly into the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The violence of this time period motivated Nigerians to come together and form the fourth and longest lasting Republic of Nigeria in 1999. The country came together after several decades of military rule to elect a Christian from the south named Chief Obasanjo. A new constitution was also drafted to transition Nigeria into democracy and reaffirm the country's secular character. Despite the achievement of the Fourth Republic and the reinstitution of secularism, voting patterns after 1999 quickly split again along religious and regional lines over religious-related issues. Sharia law has been one of those polarizing issues in modern Nigeria. In 1999, the governor of the northern state of Zamfara re-extended Sharia law to criminality for the first time since 1914. This was a blatant re-election tactic on his part, but several other states would follow suit, and to this day, the country is still split between states that are under Sharia law and those that aren't. The issue was a major point in the 2003 election, as Muslims felt it was their right to live under full Sharia law, while Christians felt that this was unfair. Nigerian politics today have actually been able to maintain religious and ethnic equality at the national level through three principles of ethno-religious balancing. First, the president's alternate religion. Two, the president and his vice are of different religions. And three, the president's alternate region. However, in the March 2023 elections, this unspoken principle of ethno-religious balancing was broken by the All People's Congress Party, who just won the election but had a Muslim succeeding a Muslim as their presidential candidate and a dual Muslim ticket. It seems as though the Muslim North is playing back into its tendency to dominate national politics, which risks stoking returned religious violence. However, much like India, not all hope is lost for Nigeria. In the riots of the 1980s and 1990s, Pastor James and Imam Ashafa each led gangs in the city of Kaduna. During one fateful clash, Ashafa's men cut James's arm off as he was defending a church, and James's Christian militia retaliated by killing two of Ashafa's brothers as well as his spiritual mentor. The two became sworn enemies on that day. However, the two men were reunited in the mid-1990s when they were brought together in a meeting of community leaders. Each of them went back to their communities and had powerful spiritual experiences, as detailed in the documentary, The Imam and the Pastor. Ashafa recounted the story of Muhammad forgiving those who persecuted him in Mecca, and James recounted the story of Jesus asking for mercy upon those who crucified him. Though it took years to build actual trust between the two battle-hardened men now run the Interfaith Mediation Center in the very city they once fought in, due to their faith and respect for each other's devotion. Now, these case studies demonstrate that we are living in a post-secular era, where both secular and religious dynamics continue to influence each other as separate but intertwined forces in society, culture, and politics. Nationality was supposed to be distinct from religion when India was made into a nation, but Indians nearly unanimously rejected this notion. However, after independence, the Hindu right responded by defining Indianness as being Hindu, whereas the Congress Party took the concept of secularism and infused it with traditional Indian beliefs of tolerance and syncretism. Nigerians also refuse to separate their national identities from their religious ones. Today, voting lines have become split along religious issues, and since the colonial founders of modern Nigeria emphasized religious differences as opposed to shared values, the attempts to implement secular governments have been thrown off course by retrenchment into religious identities. If the shared values of Islam and Christianity have been emphasized instead, perhaps modern Nigeria would more mimic the relationship of James and Ashafa. In both India and Nigeria, secularism has been unable to displace religion, and it most likely never will, because religion is something that speaks deeply to humans around the world. Being religious is not contradictory to being liberal or being modern, as those who colonized India and Nigeria have suggested, as demonstrated by the stories of interfaith efforts in Nigeria and the reconciliation of imams and pastors in Nigeria. Allowing faith to flourish may actually be necessary to solving today's crises. Thank you.
It does not seem as if Nigeria has an organized religious movement similar to the BJP in India. Does that fragmentation of the religious community and among Islam in Nigeria make this more problematic or more hopeful?
It can be more problematic in the sense that, like, if you look at the Muslim perspective, you do have like the very radical portions of it, like Boko Haram, but then you also have just political interest groups like the J&I that are much more moderate and actually want to work in the system to promote like Muslim nationality. But
are you optimistic about these case studies in the sense of more reconciliation happening, or do you think this is going to still lead to more fragmentation, more religiously and culturally inspired violence in the future?
Mm-hmm. For the foreseeable future, it seems like India is going to keep heading in a more authoritarian direction under the BJP. And I don't see the riots going on in Nigeria right now over the breaking of ethno-religious like balancing to quiet down anytime soon. So it does seem like that they will get worse. However, I did find that like playing more into faith and what they actually mean, like in a non-politicized format, would actually be the solution to solving these issues rather than like shoving off of those religious identities, like how it's been tried in the past in India and Nigeria.
Good answer. Mr. Vaughn.
Mm-hmm.
Back to Nigeria for a second, well, with India, Hinduism, it has been present for such a long time naturally. And with Nigeria, you're dealing with Christianity and Islam, which are maybe more recent imports, in comparison. I wondered if you ran across anything in Nigeria with animist native religions and what their role might be and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, with traditional African religions, they've definitely like mixed with both Islam and Christianity. And so those ideas that like in those like animist religions, there also was less delineation between political and spiritual authorities. And that sort of like will carry over into Christianity and Islam in Nigeria, in that like it's much harder to separate those identities from your
Yeah.
spirituality and your political beliefs.
Yeah, that's all over the literature too. You look at like
Yeah, for
Chinua
sure.
Achebe, great.
Mhm.
And then, thinking about the post-colonial framework here, are there any post-colonial nations that are getting it right, or is there anything outside the post-colonial framework that seems to be working? Because I'm also thinking of some nations that were not post-colonial, that the same mess is affecting.
There were definitely a lot of case studies that I like had to cut that I wanted to. And like, some were also post-colonial, some were outside of that framework, like the actual colonists. But as far as where this is working, I didn't study any other country specifically, like where it was working, but I did find like so many instances in the countries that I did study of India and Nigeria where like interfaith efforts were going to be the solution. So
Good.
Mhm.
Good.
I had a similar question, and we talked about this when you were planning.
Yeah.
And I kept coming back to it while I was reading.
Mhm.
How could you make the secular trends that you read about in India and Nigeria relatable to a modern society outside of those two countries?
Mhm. Could you ask your question again?
Yes. So in other words, you studied those two countries
Mhm.
and the relationships between the political experiences and beliefs and then the secular and how they intertwined or divided the country. So in thinking like he just asked about other countries,
Yeah.
how could you make what you learned about India and Nigeria relatable to
for
modern
sure.
societies outside of those two?
Everywhere, yeah. Even with like nations like the US that like, were proponents of secularism and it was like, enshrined in the Constitution originally. Religious like tendencies like still broken out here. And it speaks to the fact that like you can't repress those directly and just expect everybody to give those up. But if you can embrace like what those religions actually say, because in the opening of my paper, I talk about how no religion like actively promotes violence against one another religion or division, but definitely like I believe nations outside of the West, and I'm sure there's many like studies and case studies out there that you could do where like interfaith efforts would yield similar results in bringing peace as opposed to division. But, yeah.
So I have high hopes for you in the future, and I know you're going to do great things,
Thank you.
Josh. And I think this will probably be something that moves you in your future. I see that you're greatly interested in it. I was curious, when you study humanities, I think you learn from the past and how you can apply that to something that you care about in the future. So how could you take what you've learned from what you've written and apply it towards something that you're hopeful for in the future?
Well, yeah, I've always like talked about wanting to work in diplomacy or international relations, like in some capacity. So I think what's like really important about this thesis that I've taken away is that like there are limits to like Western culture as seen in India and Nigeria, and that you can't just like force what you believe onto them. And so like getting their perspective and like what their like culture / religions have to offer would be like very important to solving the actual issue in that country. But great question.
Thank you.
Congratulations on doing
Thank
a
you.
great job. You're killing it. As a latecomer to your thesis committee, I would like to ask a little bit about like your selection process for India and Nigeria. Why those two? Why not like say Northern Ireland, since you had your paper a couple of years ago on that? So what was it about these two that made the perfect one for your thesis?
So when I was originally planning this thesis, I had around 5 countries I was going to do, but I realized like with the detail I wanted to go into, like that wouldn't be feasible like in 1 year. So I cut it down to 2 post-colonial states because I thought that framework was really interesting. Because like I was saying earlier, I think it shows that large swaths of the world in like Asia and Africa just aren't compatible with like the Western understanding of how religion functions and like Western style of government, how that would work with Western religion. And so I ended up cutting like militant Buddhism in Southeast Asia, the Zionist movement in Israel, as well as Greek Orthodoxy in Russia and how Putin is using that to justify the Ukrainian war. But a lot of those aren't post-colonial states. So I just decided to narrow down on this aspect of it.
Kind of along the same lines, I do like the post-colonial connection, but we have seen a larger global divergence from secularism. And I'm wondering if you see just any kind of global trends that connect the, not so post-colonial states to your case studies. And, how do we reconcile that, say, in a country like the United States, where you have seen more of an integration of religion into politics recently?
I couldn't find like an exact answer about why, like in the 1980s, for example, there was religious resurgence in so many different like faiths in different countries around the world, whether they were colonial or colonists or post-colonial. But it seems like just those influences or those movements influence each other, or perhaps like just at the same time, because they all took place around 30-ish years after the secularization thesis. So it may have just been like, that's the amount of time it took to see that like, you can't just repress those identities, and that's the amount of time it took for them to spring back, is what I wrote about. Audience questions? Okay, Jana.
Okay, so if like Hindu nationalism like disappears and interfaith talks start happening like more frequently in India, do you think that India and Pakistan's relationship will like strengthen? And also, do you think that the I guess like stigmatization and biases between those 2 countries will like easily disappear, or will it take time?
Well, okay, even within India, like those tensions will not easily disappear, even if you can just get like people of different faiths to, be in the same room and talk about how their faiths can work together. But I mean, I still believe that that's like a very important first step to allowing that to happen, because like in Nigeria, which is a different country, that was what led the pastor and the imam in Kaduna to be able to start like reconciling their differences in their past. So I would say yes to that, but it's not going to be like an overnight fix, like by any means. So. Jonathan?
So for non-secular governments that have this, that have a dominating religion that has power in the government, and with the there's a common theme of like oppression of the minority or various minority religions, with an exception being India, which traditionally has a past of like tolerance and syncretism. But how do you think that in these non-secular governments that have these dominating powers that are dominating religions that aren't as open to tolerance, how can or can not secularism be used as a medium for tolerance, and what are the challenges for that?
So yeah, when secularism was like implemented into India and Nigeria, it very quickly took on a separate definition than how it did in the West. Because like where in the West it could mean like non-religious, in these countries it began to mean being tolerant of all religions and equally respecting and whatnot. So I believe that secularism still has a role, definitely in like say a religious theology or theocracy like Iran, where it can be helpful to promote like more inclusivity and understanding of other religions. Like definitely religious attitudes and secular attitudes are both here to stay. And so that's like what the definition of the post-secular era is, where you can draw on both of those concepts. Any other questions? Anya?
Would you say that the rise of the international media would you say that that has contributed to like this kind of religious revivalism or like rise of modern populism?
Yeah, the media was like, I didn't cover it much in my defense, but like that is how like a lot of religious movements were able to rally supporters and like spread conspiracy theories, which is pretty important, as I touched on with like Love Jihad in India. But yeah, I mean, the media, like even in Merriam's thesis, can be used for like good or bad things, and it depends on how it's used. So,
What about economics? How does relative deprivation and marginalization play into religious tension, and how does it play into this narrative?
I'll use Nigeria as an example first. I touched on it in the presentation, but the South became much more richer and more affluent than the North. And the North, you know, they remained much poor, and they just took on like a religious coloration. And so when the economics of this took on that, then it became like a lot more violent and heated, because a lot of conspiracy theories were also being shared in the North that like this was all one giant thing to disprivilege Muslims and improve the quality of life of Christians.
A piece of advice, or just answer this question, and maybe the juniors will, take it in. What's the most challenging part of this 8 to 9 month, journey? The research, the writing, the organization, time management, as they head into their senior year in thesis. What would you advise them, and how would you advise them? In what area did you find most challenging?
I think the area that I've struggled in the most was outlining, for sure. And I would sometimes start writing without having like a clear plan about how I wanted my arguments to flow. And so then when you're dealing with this topic like this, where you're working with religion and politics, then it can get very muddled very quickly with what's what and like what's influencing what. So like take the time to outline. It might seem like that, researching is a huge block. You outline for a little bit and then you're writing for a huge block, but I think it's going to be really helpful if you spend more time outlining, though everyone has a different process.
Very good. Any other questions?
Looks like question.
I was just gonna say, I think that like, especially with like India and Nigeria being like post-colonial states, obviously like ethnic breakdown was really probably very influential on this topic.
Yeah.
So like, how would you say that like Nigeria being like an artificial state, like how would that like post-colonial ethnic like breakdown affect the religious tensions?
Yeah, I mean, with both India and Nigeria, but especially Nigeria, I mean, ethnicity becomes conflated with religion all the time. Whereas like you have the House of Fulani people in the north that are like mostly all Muslim, and then you have the Igbo people in the south, which are mostly Christian, and then you can have some groups like the Yoruba and other tribes that are half and half. But it just adds another component to the division in like the religious coloration of that, like economics can like heat those more. So Ben, you have a question?
Okay. So you mentioned Iran earlier in like a response. Do you see like India and the BJP? Do you see that like moving towards like a theocracy like Iran, or is it not going like that?
That's a good question. With the laws that are being implemented that are like being designed to legitimately increase the Hindu population and like make sure other like religious minorities don't grow to take that majority, then if that keeps up, then yes, it could turn into a theocracy where laws are more based on Hinduism. So no problem. Sarah.
So with the increase of like religious political mobilization in the United States, is there like some absolutely must nots that we can learn from what we learned in Nigeria and India?
That's a good question. I mean, I talked about with like the main takeaway was like to heed the perspective of other religions and not just like, from my perspective, like the Western gaze on it essentially. But I mean, even in the US, if you can take a look at the perspective of other people, like on the other side of it, and other religions in America, then yeah, I think that's a great lesson that can be taken away, even from like India and Nigeria's experiences with religion. So, yeah.
So I actually had this prepared for Miriam, but now that you brought up the Western gaze,
Perfect.
So while doing research and taking notes
Uh,
and writing your thesis, did you ever have moments where you found it difficult to set aside your Western gaze?
yeah, for sure.
And so, how did you make sure that your writing was, or your writing process was free of the Western gaze?
I don't know if it was completely free, but to combat that, what I tried to do was find perspectives from people of other faiths in other countries. The most helpful one in Nigeria was definitely that documentary that had, the interviews with Pastor Jameson and Mama Shapa. And in India, I read a lot of like excerpts from, first person accounts like Dr. Singh about like how faiths would work together during partition. So I tried to intersplice a lot of first person narratives and try and understand what they were trying to communicate as opposed to just taking away what I would learn from it. Ms. King?
I have a question. I'm trying to formulate it, but
Okay.
when we talk about religion and human geography, we've talked
Yeah.
about how both Islam and Christianity are proselytizing religions, and so
Yeah.
it almost makes sense that there might be some conflict in Nigeria, but Hinduism, of course, is more of a personal path and it's non-proselytizing. So how is it justifiable or beneficial to have that nationalistic component tied to more of an ethnic religion?
So that is a very good point, that Hinduism also differentiates from a lot of other Western faiths, and that it's non-proselytizing. But I didn't include in this presentation, but I almost did. But the Hindu reformist movements that I talked about that happened in like the late 1800s and early 1900s, the name's escaping me of what it's called, but it was like a major part of that is that you can convert people back to Hinduism on the premise that they were originally led astray by different religions. And so they're almost like going back and trying to justify proselytization in order to, again, grow the Hindu like majority, protect their majority in India. So, yeah. Jana?
I just have one last question. So
Okay.
you talked a lot about like solutions like interfaith talks, but like how exactly like would you initiate those like interfaith talks, and like are there any other like concrete solutions that like have been like thought of or just like or
The most successful like instances, especially in India, of like interfaith talks and interfaith like groups working together, unfortunately have been like when crisis strikes and they realize that they need to set aside those differences. So I'm not saying that you need to create a crisis for two groups to solve each other, but in India and Nigeria, their interfaith talks just began by like the governor of Kaduna wanting to like stop the violence in his community. So he brought them together, and that helped them on their own like spiritual journeys to forgive one another. So, I mean, it just starts with like that first step, I would say. That's it. Yeah.
Committee, come on up. Real deal committee. Well, we can. Yeah, get the title. We're gonna go back to the title. He was in it. Did I hear a rumor you were at 1 hour the first time you did this practice defense? Maybe.
If you could not be in front of the title slide, and if you could kind of not be so much in front of this window.
Okay, so you want to split? You want to split?
It doesn't matter, but I think I like it. Closer towards that way.
Yeah.
Got it?
I think that'll work.
Got the casual look.
Here we are. 1, 2, 3.
You want to try. All right.
All right.
We get it? Oh, you did a great job.
Congratulations.
So,
Very proud of you.
thank you, Ms. Prim, for
I never
coming.
feel like I had anything to offer.
I heard that is for help.
I had to think long and hard what I'm gonna have. Very good. I think it was like over the long weekend, I think I read like 50 or 60 pages, like, okay, I gotta figure out what's going on here. Here we go.
Yeah.
Juniors.
Very proud. Oh, that was the best.
Hey, I'm Kyle. I'm Josh's English teacher this year. My medal went over there.
Yes.
He carried the team.
Did you line up? And then they walked in.
But seniors always process. I don't know if that's the same case, but.
Just don't remember the freshmen they did.
Oh, no, I don't think that they.
Oh, yeah.
When we do school activities, we always practice processional,
Oh, okay.
but
Yeah.
I don't think that's necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I think they just go sit down. But it might be helpful for them to be advertised since they do the awards in alphabetical order. So that might be a.
You want to get a picture?
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Now you're like, okay, yes. Yeah, he's live. Yeah. Yeah. He's watching online.
Oh, he's watching online.
Y'all wanna
Who
look
is?
over here? One, second part, 1, 2, 3.
You didn't want your sister. You can take a selfie or something.
Of course.
She was.
You want to be in there too?
Great job, man. Great job.
You can do thesis, Emily?
Give it one time.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Joy,
teaching.
a joy to work with. Oh, thank you guys so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming. Joy to teach. You're gonna do great things wherever you go. This meeting is always a joy to come back for thesis time, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We've got a great academic community here.
No, my room was already a mess. I think that's okay. I can subtract to your, future skip days. Just let them think my room has already been hit because I had National History Day all over the place. All right, so look, I started a folder. So whoever, if you want to share, I'm going to share it with you right now, and I'll put it in the national folder. Our department folder.
Oh, Josh, do we need to just, the computer?
Yeah. You're supposed to shut his computer, he said. He'll leave it up for tomorrow. No, not right now.
So.
No.
Oh, so
I have
you-
two slides I made.
Where that's-
Thank you.